It's election day, and I am here to give you my expectations, and we'll do a judgment video after this, depending on how the results go. Will the ANC remain above 50? What will happen to the DA? Who will be the third biggest party, the EFF or MK? All that and more, plus a bonus section on what my team thinks is going to happen today. Let's get into it. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, my name is Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. And by the way, we are just a few hundred, as I shoot this video, subscribers away from 100,000 subscribers. We set an ambitious target at the beginning of this year to hit 100,000 subscribers by election day. And it's incredible. On election day, the very day it looks like it's going to happen. If you haven't already subscribed, help us get to that 100,000 mark. Okay, so in today's video, we're going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to look at what the polls have been saying and look at what the data on this election and opinion surveys are showing in terms of the final national result. Then, I'm going to give you my expectations. Caveat: no one can predict the future. No one knows what people are going to do when they get into that booth. If they start hearing Sarafina, as soon as they get into the booth, then things can change. But I'm going to give you my expectations. And what we'll do is we'll do another video when we know the results, and I'll look back at these expectations and we'll see how close they were. And then finally, I'm going to look at some potential counter arguments to where the polls are sitting and where my expectations are sitting. And bonus, we'll look at what my team has predicted for this election and see where they stand. Okay, so let's get into it. And first, I want to show you where the polls are sitting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up on the screen now 3 recent polls. And what we're going to do is look at where all of these polls are. And then I'm going to show you what the average of the polls is. Now, a good rule of thumb with polling is to take the average of different polls so that you can get a sense of where they might all be wrong and average that out. And that's a trick that I learned from a book called Super Forecasting. You should check that book out. So we have 3 polls. Now, I'm excluding the Brenthurst Foundation poll because that was a very long time ago. And I'm only taking polls that are at least a month old. So we've got the IPSOS poll, which came out in April, and that is the orange bar. So that's the orange bar. And you'll see the different parties. So we've got the ANC, the DA, the EFF. So I'm predicting what I think will be the top 4. Or not predicting, but just looking at what the expectations are. And then the yellow bar, the first bar, is the Mark Data ENCA poll, which came out about 2 weeks ago. And then the red bar, is the SRF projection, which they released yesterday, taking their daily tracking poll, which they've been doing all throughout the last month, and then they did a final election projection. And then I've got the average, which is the pink bar, which is the average of these 3 different polls. So I've got 3 of the most recent polls to look at. Now, why is it important to look at the polls? Because I've seen a lot of people saying polls are useless, don't look at the polls. Well, the fact of the matter is that polls are better than your gut feel. Because your gut feel is based on what your grandma said to you yesterday and the particular road that you drove down and which election poster and which billboard you saw. The polls speak to thousands of people, and it's a more data-driven approach. Now, it doesn't mean that they're perfect, but I actually place more stock in the polls than I do any other metric because no one speaks to 3,000 people in a day. Right? So another thing to look at is where the polls were in previous elections, because I want to demonstrate that the polls can actually be quite a good guide, especially when you average them out. So in the past election, in 2019, let's look at IPSOS. The SRF didn't exist, but IPSOS, in their medium voter turnout scenario, which I think is likely. We had 66% turnout, which I think is roughly where we're going to end. In the last election, they had the ANC at 61. They had the DA at 19. And they had the EFF at 11. And what happened? Well, the ANC was a little overestimated. They ended up at 57 instead of 61. But you can see that it's in the same ballpark. It was about 4 points off, or 3.5 points off. The DA came in at just about 20. So they were 1 point off with the DA in the last election. And the EFF was exactly at 11. So they got the EFF exactly right. So you can see that the polls are not always perfect. But even if we just look at IPSOS, they managed to get it relatively spot on. They were 3.5 points off with the ANC, which they over predicted. Let's look at mark data in the last election. In the last election, mark data predicted that the ANC would get 60. ANC got 57. They predicted the DA would get 20. DA got 2021. And they predicted the EFF would get 11, and the EFF got 11. So these polls can actually be quite close, especially the closer you get to an election. Now, of course, this election is inherently unpredictable. We have a new party, the MK party, and we don't know what's going to happen with that, although some polls have come out with the MK. So there's probably a bit more unpredictability in this election than the last election, but the polls can serve as a guide. Okay, so let's come back to the average of the polls then. So what do we have? We've got the ANC nationally sitting at 42% when we average IPSOS, mark data, and the SRF projection. I'm not going to lie, that sounds like a crazy number, particularly given that the ANC is at 57. But again, what are we basing this on? Are we basing this on our gut feel or actual numbers of people who've actually been polled and surveyed? So the ANC average number is 42. The DA's average is 21. These are the pink bars. The EFF's average is 11. And interestingly, the MK average is 11. So that's what the polls are telling us, the most recent polls. If we average the three out, that the ANC is on 42, that the DA is on 21, the EFF is on 11, and MK is on 11, which would make for an absolutely spectacular election result. So given that, let me tell you what my expectations are for this election, and let's see what you make of them. Cool, so I think it's always fun to play the game of prediction, but look, prediction, is virtually impossible. All I can say is these are my expectations, and do with them what you will. Like I said, I place great stock in the opinion polling, not as an ultimate predictor, but as a ballpark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you within 2% of what I think is going to happen. Now, the prevailing wisdom in this election is that the ANC is going to squeak over the line. It's going to just about hang on to its 50%. I disagree. But I think the polls for the ANC, I'm also just a little worried that the polls are a little bearish on the ANC. And there may be a final surge. So instead of 42, I'm going to put the ANC at 44. And with a 2% margin for error. So they could be 46, they could be 42, but my final expectation is 44. Now, it's a big call because that would be an absolutely unprecedented result, but I'm going to be led by the data and the numbers rather than the noise. And I'm going for an expectation of ANC in and around 44. In terms of the DA, I'm thinking more like 20 than 21. So I'm revising the average based on my analysis of where the DA is, and I think they're going to be more like 20 than 21. So my final expectation is going to be 20 for the DA. Could be 22, could be 18, but I think in and around the 20 mark is where I'm going to go for the DA. Now things get interesting, and my suspicion is that the polls, particularly the SRF, is slightly over predicting the DA and under predicting the EFF. And so I'm going to go for EFF at in and around 12. So could be 9, could be 14, but the central figure I would go for there is 12. And then MK, I'm just going to go for the exact polling average because I have no idea what's going to happen with MK. Anything could happen. So I'm just going to be led by the numbers there. And I'm going to say 11. So my final expectations as we go into this election are that we're going to have a seismic election, a massive result in which the ANC falls to below 50. The DA stays roughly where it is. The EFF stays roughly where it is, and MK rises to an unprecedented around 11% mark. The story of this election being that the ANC has fallen, that the two other biggest opposition parties have neither risen nor fallen, and that the MK is the biggest new party ever in a South African election. In addition to that, I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to say that the ANC will lose Gauteng. The ANC, when I say lose, I mean go below 50. The ANC will go below 50 in KZN. And I think the ANC is going to go below 50 in the Northern Cape. Yes, one other province. I don't know because there isn't enough data where the Northern Cape is. So now I am just bringing in my political intuitions. But given where the Northern Cape was in the 2021 election, if you add up the entire province, that province is on a knife's edge, and I think it's going to go with the trend overall, and the ANC will fall below 50 there. What I would say, I just don't know what's going to happen in these provinces because there isn't enough data, but I would keep a very close eye on Free State because that's going to be interesting. I would keep a very close eye on Northwest because that's also going to be very interesting. And then, so after Western Cape, Gauteng, and KZN, the next three most interesting provinces in this election for me are going to be Northern Cape, Free State, Northwest. The next most interesting race is going to be in Mpumalanga because I'll be fascinated to see how MK does there and whether they can bring the ANC majority, which has always been like over 2/3 in Mpumalanga down. And then I'm very certain that the ANC is going to win Limpopo and the Eastern Cape. So that's definitely happening. So we're going to have an election, in my view, in which we are entering a new era of South African politics. This election will herald the demise of ANC dominance. However, the ANC will remain the biggest party in most provinces, probably 7 out of the 9 or 8 out of the 9. It will still be the biggest party nationally. And it will be very close to see whether the ANC can get a coalition with smaller parties. But I think it might just hit that 44 mark, in which case it's going to be very interesting to see whether it can build a coalition with smaller parties or whether it has to attract the interest of one of the bigger parties. But let's talk about coalitions after the results come in. What I will also give you is some tips about how to know what's going to happen in this election. I would pay very close attention to the CSIR projection. The CSIR has projected elections virtually perfectly every time, and they can do it quite early. They need between 5 and 10% of votes counted, and once they get that number, they can then project the election very accurately. Now, in 2019, the CSIR was able to project a very close election, very close to the final result in the morning of the following day. at around 5 a.m., they came out with a call that was pretty close. They had the EFF at 9 at that time. They actually ended up at 11, but they were pretty close. They had the ANC exactly at 57. So what I would do, relax today, obviously vote. We're voting, right? If you're not voting, then I don't even know if you can even be like a member of this channel, because like we vote around here. No, I'm joking. But I hope you're voting. And so vote today. And don't listen to the noise today, because today is going to be noisy. Social media, everyone's going to be trying to get out the vote, and you're going to be swayed many different ways. Wake up tomorrow morning, go and search for the CSIR projection, and check, have they counted between 5 and 10% of voting districts? Particularly when they get closer to 10, which I expect. I'm not so sure because we now have 3 ballots, so I think the voting might take a bit longer. But my expectation is that around 12 tomorrow, being Thursday the 30th, the CSIR should have a fairly robust prediction. And you can then bet on that prediction. So what I'll do tomorrow is that when the CSIR has its projections, I'll do a video comparing my expectations today with the CSIR projections, which will be very close to the result, and we'll see. Also have a look at Davi Schultz on Twitter, who's also going to be doing work with News 24. He also has a very good election projection model. And between the CSIR and Davi, I think you should be able to form a fairly solid picture tomorrow. Let's see how fast the counting goes. But once we get 5 to 10% of the results, then we can really start being certain about what's happening in this election. Having given you my expectations, let me come to some of the counter arguments to my perspective, which are probably the dominant view that the ANC is going to hang on. And let's consider those because they are a serious position as well. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the counter arguments that suggest that the ANC will hang on to its majority. Now, the first view here is that the ANC will not fall so far from 57 to 40, 44, 42, where the polls have them, because that would constitute an unprecedented dip in its electoral support. Now, that's true and not true, actually. In the 2021 local government elections, the ANC has already fallen below 50% nationally. Now, there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between local elections and national elections, but there have actually been very similar results in local elections and national elections that followed, for example, in 2011 and 2014. And it's not clear to me that the ANC is any stronger today than it was in the 2021 local government election. If anything, I think the ANC was stronger in that election because there was no MK party. So what I think people may be missing as they say that the ANC will hang on to 50% is if there was no MK, I might agree with that. But I think the MK party really is a game changer in this election, and I think they're going to hurt the ANC. I also think they're going to hurt the EFF to the extent that I think this would have been a breakout election for the EFF. I think they would have gotten closer to 18, 19% of the vote if there was no MK. But now I think the MK has eaten from the ANC undecided vote as well as the EFF vote to some extent. So, but I will give you this. The ANC has never fallen so far before. It usually falls in like 5% increments, if that. However, consider the fact that there is no law that a political party has to fall in a linear manner. And often around the world, when a political party finally does fall, it actually happens at an increasing rate. So it's always hard to know when is that election when the bottom falls out. And I think this is that election, but others may think it's 2029. And I completely respect that position, and I may well be wrong. So the other argument which I have time for is that even though people feel like they're not going to vote ANC, when they get into the booth, something is going to happen in their hearts, and Sarafina will start playing, and those apartheid documentaries will come in front of their eyes, and the walls will close in, and the ANC on the ballot will glow. And I must say, there is something special and sacred about Election Day, and you feel it. It's a public holiday. There aren't a lot of cars on the road. And you're like, wow, this is really amazing. We are part of a minority of people in the entire world who actually have a democracy and who can actually choose genuinely, not just a fake democracy, but a real democracy where we get to decide our government and we have a credible election. And people may wake up today and just be like, you know what, the ANC deserves one last chance. Can I remind you that you said they deserved one last chance in the last election? You can't have two last chances. A last chance means last chance, people. But maybe in that voting booth, people have a change of heart, and there's no way to predict that. But that could happen. And if that happens, then the polls will be disproven this election more than ever. However, what I would say to that is, yeah, but there are also a lot of angry people. There are a lot of people who remember the last 5 years. There are a lot of people who remember what stage 6 load shedding felt like. There are a lot of people who remember all the promises that were made about the economy growing, and they remember that the economy is shrinking, that things are much more expensive than they've ever been. There are people who remember the corruption and the failure to deal with corruption. So I think there are also a lot of very ready people to vote against the ANC in this election. However, as I say, time will tell. And predictions and this forecasting they say you should never do it, but I think it's fun to do it. And, you know, whether we're right or wrong, it doesn't mean anything. It just means that I'm telling you what I'm feeling about this election and the methods that I tend to use to forecast an election. So let me know down in the comments below whether you think that my expectations are conform with yours or whether you think I'm off. And it'll be fun to do the follow-up video to see what actually happens in this election. The fact of the matter is that no one actually knows. And that's the beauty of this election. This is the first time in our country's history where we've had a real election where no one actually knows if any party is going to be able to get a majority. And I think that's quite an incredible moment for the history of this country. Okay, let's go into the bonus section where we look at what members of my team have been saying. And we have a friendly, fun, non-monetary bet going on. And you'll see that I happen to be in the minority. So things are getting rough. Things are getting rough. Let's go to the bonus section. Okay, bonus section. And I'm going to put up on the screen now. So my team is Lesego, behind the camera. Bongs, who's the director. Oratile, who is the producer, who gets the guests and makes sure that the show keeps ticking along. And, of course, me. Now, Oratile and I have a separate bet in which one of us has to shave our beard if we get it wrong. So let's see what everyone is saying. Okay, so we're just predicting the big four nationally. So we have me coming in with ANC at 44, and we're going to give everyone a 2% margin for error, right? So I'm very much in the minority. Bongs says ANC 51. Oratile says ANC 51. And Lesego says ANC 50. It's peak. It's real. It's real in these streets. If I'm wrong, it's gonna be rough. Okay, then I'm coming in with DA 20. Bongs DA 18. Oratile DA 19. And Lesego is DA 20. Thank you, Lesego. Thank you. Yes, we agree. At least we agree on one thing. I'm coming in EFF 12. Bongs EFF 12. My man. Oratile EFF 13. And Lesego EFF stays at 11. And then MK, I'm at 11. Bongs is at 9. Oratile is at 8. Lesego's at 8. So, let me know which of us you agree with down in the comments below. Who's going to walk away with the spoils? We haven't decided what the winner should get. Let us know in the comments what the winner should get. But after, when we do the results video, probably tomorrow, we will then bring this back up and we'll see who won the SMWX election sweepstakes. Fam, thank you so much for joining us on this wild ride of an election campaign. And of course, we'll be right there with you with lots of episodes throughout this week to make sense of the results and what they could mean for the formation of a government going forward. Keep locked on this channel, set your notifications, help us get over 100,000 subscribers. If you're listening via a podcast, give us a positive rating. And let's continue to build this independent digital community which reflects on South African politics through interviews and analysis. Happy voting, everyone. Aye.